YouTube. I'm going to keep this intro nice and short for you guys. In this video, I'm going to be reading a section of my writing, actually. This is a short story that I have yet to finish, admittedly. This is sort of the first chunk of that short story, and it is based on a dream that I had. And I was so inspired by this dream that I ended up drawing two of its main characters, Orion and Relia, and that is what you're seeing me draw now. So I wanted to read to you from what I have written of this story, just the first section of what I have, so that you guys can have a little bit of an introduction to these characters. If you're at all interested in reading the rest of the story, I will be posting the rest of it on Wattpad. I am on Wattpad, but by a different username than my YouTube channel, so I will link that in the description down below, just in case you guys want to hear it. So without further ado, I'm going to be reading, part 1 from a story that I've tentatively entitled The Lost's Liberation. Orion Devros was never allowed a good life. From the time he was born, his family was in poverty. They lived in a settlement barely large enough to be called a village, where the houses were shoddy and where the winters were harsh and cold. The buildings were falling apart, and the people were likewise nearing the end of their vitality and strength. Food was scarce, and happiness was even more so. To make the dire straits worse, what few resources the people could gather were halved by the large, overbearing militia which had taken control some years before. They argued that they would be protectors, but the instances of missing children and people found dead after one soldier or another got too drunk proved that their claims were nothing more than a ploy to get as much as they could from as many as they could. Their reach spread over many villages, and from each they took half of their livelihoods as tribute. If only food had been all they took. To bolster their numbers, the militia had developed a devilish plan. The citizens were hardly able to fight back when soldiers stormed their homes and took any able-bodied sons the village people had to offer. They took each into the militia and trained them as soldiers. They sent them far away from their families to another troop of murderers and trained them to be just the same. Few boys ever returned, and even if they did, they were not the same people as they had once been. One such child was Orion. He was torn from house and home and sent away to a place where the only familiar thing to give him any hope was the snow. He was brought there with a small cluster of boys and trained to use a variety of weapons. Rapidly, it became clear that Orion was drawn to a one-handed sword in particular. Others gravitated to longbows, crossbows, shield strikes, broadswords. If you could name it, it was likely the militia had stolen it from the remains of an armory and shoved it into the hands of a child too young to understand its use. Orion excelled. Quickly, he mastered the one-handed sword, then the broadsword, then the cross and longbows. Before long, he was one of their most promising recruits. He was so promising, in fact, that he was given a gift. In the dead of night, Orion was taken out of the barracks and brought into a dark, shadowy clearing in the forest. A box was presented to him and opened to reveal creatures that resembled twisted, deformed children. These creatures were difficult to look at, but Orion knew what they were on sight. They were Windins. Windins always came in threes, and there were 2 who relied on the alpha, and then the alpha itself, though to call these creatures alpha and beta would seem wrong. You see, Windins are docile creatures with the power to manipulate space, objects, and even time. People could be frozen in a moment. They would not age, but their bodies would starve all the same. A flower would look as lush and luminous as ever until the spell was released, when it would crumble into dust and fade away forever. Orion was swiftly bound to the Alpha and became the creature's master. He trained alongside them. Together they learned how to channel the magic within the Windins and, more importantly to the militia, how to utilize it in battle. Orion was to be their secret weapon and, just as the militia had hoped, he excelled at this too. What the militia failed to anticipate, however, was the desperation of a young boy to find his family again. Now in his early teens, he concocted a plan. He would freeze his superiors long enough to set himself and the others free. It was a genius plan. Nothing could possibly go wrong, he thought. But Orion had never been more wrong in his life. When he attempted to make a move, he found himself swiftly overwhelmed and, in a moment of panic, he unleashed the magic of his familiars. All 3 of them. The entire barracks and its surrounding camp went still. People hung motionless in the air. Friends and comrades, children and recruits, enemies and torturers. Any man, woman, child, or animal unlucky enough to stand nearby was swiftly entranced and trapped within the child's errant spell. Even the grass and snow fell still. Orion collapsed to his knees and wept. The Windens came to his side to comfort him, to touch one of those they had harmed unknowingly, and Orion screamed. "Away with you," he cried. "I never want to see you again. Go." And, as their master bid, they left, and Orion was alone, coiled into his brother's arms with nothing but his freezing tears and the heaving of his lungs to remind him he was alive. Orion stayed in that way for 2 whole days before he was found, shivering and near death. He was proclaimed the sole survivor of a demonic attack, and the village people who found him nursed him slowly back to health. The process took many months. After all, how can you heal a man with no will to survive? His stupor was broken only when he discovered that he was only a few miles from the village he had once called home. Calling upon what little strength he had left, Orion made the trek back to his home, only to discover that, while the militia was gone, so too was his family. A criminal, a man by the name of MacLeod, had savagely killed many inhabitants along with the militant defenders. Orion's sisters were dead, and the rest of his family was separated and lost to the wind. He knew in his gut he would never see them again. The blow hit Orion hard, but instead of shattering and losing all will to live, Orion simply closed off his heart and became a hermit. He was all but a ghost, haunting the home he used to live in and wandering without a friend to his name. He was a hermit in the city of the lost, and he intended to stay that way. But, as with all plans in Orion's life, this too was to go astray. The end of Orion's lonely existence was brought about by a woman who walked into town dressed in a ratty blue dress, a thick brown cloak, and an air of importance. Beside her were 2 companions, one a woman with short blonde hair shaved off on the sides of her head, and the other a badly scarred man who never spoke a word. The woman asked around, and, upon learning his location, she sought out Orion. She was determined to get his help in a mysterious mission to take down a league of criminals. Orion, thoroughly embittered, saw no point in some fake noblewoman's crusade. For every line of self-importance she gave him, Orion had a retort to destroy her claims. "You're no noblewoman," he told her. "No noblewoman would be caught dead in a dress like yours. And I've no time for people who pretend to be what they are not." For many minutes the woman tried to persuade him. Nearing half an hour the 2 bickered and bantered while Orion strode through the city, ducking into and out of ruins in an attempt to ditch her. And, for the moment, it seemed to be working. The woman's footsteps were becoming harder to track. But it wasn't just the debris, Orion quickly realized. The longer she walked, the harder it seemed to be for her. She stumbled and, several times, hit the ground. Still, Orion was unfazed. He'd seen worse, and he hardly cared enough to be curious. That was when the woman, on her hands and knees with exhaustion and discomfort, finally yelled, "Barteliot!" Orion's blood ran cold, and he looked at her, demanding answers. The woman explained. Her goal was to remove the vicious criminal from his seat of power, and to take down the other criminals who worked with him in turn. Orion questioned her reasons, and in that moment it was the woman's turn to be obstinate. "I don't have to tell you anything about my life. It doesn't concern you," she asserted. Faced with the possibility of revenge, Orion's hermit life finally came to an end. "I will help you," he said, "but I am not your companion, only your ally." The girl, who revealed her name to be Relia, agreed. Still, she struggled to get to her feet, and, with the arrival of her companions, it became clear she was no longer able to move her legs. Orion offered to take her to a medical tent, but, much to his bewilderment, Relia declined. They could not help me even if they had all the time, money, and resources in the realm. So, resigning herself, Relia allowed her 2 companions to carry her to a small carriage, strapped to a horse who seemed to suffer an ailment in walking itself, only aided by the connection of the carriage which had been quite excellently engineered. Orion saddled his own horse and rode behind the carriage and its 3 occupants for many days, until the snow turned into simple cold, and the mud and death of winter turned into tall yellow grass of the plains beyond. Orion had never traveled this far westward before, but it hardly fazed him. So little did any more.